Good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening. This has been an unbelievable day here on campus. We've started with an opportunity to be with all of those who have served as Chancellor, since Chancellor Corrigan, and then Chancellor Penny, and then Chancellor Gora, and then Chancellor Collins, and then yours truly this morning in the discussion. Then I had the opportunity to go down and have some fun on the first floor here in this building, where students were making Mother's Day and Others Days kind of gifts with everything from glassware to jewelry and to all kinds of things that could sit on the mantelpiece. And I've just come back from spending about an hour and a half. I wanted to spend about 45 minutes with our students in the College of Science and Mathematics over in the Integrated Science Center for their poster session. That was an amazing thing. But to end my evening with one of my favorite events, one that I loved when we used to do it up in the library, but now continue to love being here for it as we've done it in this room. Our annual faculty research celebration is something that's very special. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be a part of it. This event is part of our spring enrichment and engagement days, or what we call Seeds Week. Now, I know some of you say, just like the 50th anniversary, we don't know how to count what a week is. Seeds Week has probably gone on for about 14 or 15 days. Hey, listen, there's so much to jam in there because of all of you. So I'm pleased to be here this evening to have this chance to thank our faculty and our research staff for all of your many important contributions to research, your contributions to scholarship, and your contributions to innovation. You are amazing individuals, and we're so grateful to you. Your creativity, your inventiveness continues to make our university shine, and I'm so grateful for all of your hard work. I also like to thank our dean, Daniel. Daniel's back there, Ortiz. Daniel, thank you so much for all your work. Give him a round of applause. I didn't tell you this story, but I did slip away today, just to hide out for a moment. And I found my way to the 5th floor in Healy. That's a wonderful place to hang out and just put your feet up and watch and listen and just reflect. And then I found my way down to the 3rd floor in Healy, and so I was so grateful to have that opportunity. I also want to thank all of my colleagues there in Healy, in the library, for this event and all your hard work on this. Our Office of Special Events, thank you. Your work in promoting today's discussion is always something that I'm grateful for. Your efforts result in a truly engaging event that we look forward to every year. And so, as I paused to reflect, when I saw the title for this evening's presentation, Research in Action, Policymaking and Community and Child Development, that's an amazing topic for us tonight. The phrase research in action truly speaks to what it means to study and do research here at this university, the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The research done here has real-world implications that we're all so proud of. That might just be a cliche phrase somewhere else, but it's our reality, and we're extremely proud of that. Because of the extraordinary depth and breadth of our faculty's research, scholarship, and community engagement, there are many substantive examples of how research done here has solved problems. We don't have to dig too deep for how effective it's been, how it's provided crucial information, but also how it's improved lives. I think most importantly, how it's improved lives. The 3 faculty members that we'll hear from shortly have a lot to share about their own experiences with this kind of scholarship. Professor Miren Uriarte focus on the impact of language policies in the educational outcomes of English language learners in Latino communities has provided vital information to the Boston Public Schools. In appointing her to the Boston School Committee, something that we're very proud of recently, our Mayor Marty Walsh, acknowledged that she has firsthand knowledge about what policies and investments can be made to make headway on the issue of achievement gaps that persist for young Latinos and others in our great city. Don't limit her to just that one. Professor Tara Parker's research, focusing on higher education policy related to access and equity for historically underrepresented groups, includes a special interest in the ways policies such as remedial and developmental education relate to post-secondary opportunities and outcomes. As a principal investigator of the Getting Past Go project, her research has found, and it has profound implications for the state in its effort to increase college attainment rates. And Professor Douglas' research and involvement in early childhood research and policy matters at both the local and national levels has informed her efforts to help prepare the next generation of leaders and scholars in the field of early education. Her research also speaks directly to how early education and care can support and strengthen families and prevent abuse and neglect. So our professors today are excellent representation of research in action and a research that influences our community at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I'm looking forward to hearing these presentations, and I'm just so honored to be in your presence tonight. Today is about celebrating. It's about celebrating the power of our reach as a university community to help our students attain knowledge and to train in the training infused by the depth that each of you do in your research, so they can enter the world, this world that we're preparing them for, to solve problems, not just today or tomorrow, but on into the future. Problems that will help our communities with their most pressing issues, to expand our reach and our ability to improve lives because of the work undertaken here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So I'd like to thank you again, all of you who are joining us today, and for all that you do on behalf of this university, our community, the world, and research in action. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, our Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Winston Langley, someone who looks forward to this event just as much as I do, someone who's constantly pressing us as an institution to understand what it means to be this thriving university that has become one that has grown from our beginnings out here on this wonderful peninsula to an institution that's having an impact not just for our communities here in Boston, but understanding how that has implications for the world. And so to put it in context this evening, we want to bring forward our Provost, Winston Langley. Thank you.
I don't think I ought to say very much after the Chancellor's presentation, except to say that part of the context of our being here is the idea of Seeds Week, representing the spring, when, of course, it tells its own story for the future of the year. I think we have several expressions of the idea of the seed, both in terms of the university and what it seeks to do each year with its students who begin with us, a form of seeding, or the focus on the child today, it's a form of seeding, or the idea of research, which is searching again for something new to seed, that which we cannot otherwise solve, or the idea of community, where the Germans long time ago tried to help us make a distinction between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, where the distinction between the society and the community as something far more intimate and seeking to seed something anew for the community, or the idea of policy and its origins that has implications for police and politics and everything else we can think of, that somehow it partakes of the highest levels of human concern, as the Chancellor just mentioned to us. That is, that there is no area of human activity that is more important or commends itself to the nobility to which we strive than that which seeks to look for the interest of the public as a whole, and that the community should be committed to the interest of the public as a whole. Children, the child is father of the man and the woman, seeds. And so I think it's the best context within which we can speak of development, both for the seed and that which results from the seed, hopefully the community, shaped by what might emerge as public policy. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Miren Uriarte, our first speaker. Thank you.
I wanted, first of all, to thank Chancellor Motley, Provost Langley, the Friends of the Library, for the invitation to speak to you tonight in this annual celebration of faculty research. Coming before you to answer the questions posed by Daniel Ortiz in his invitation to this event has forced me not only to think about the research that I've done in the area of education and in relationship with children, but also to think about why I embarked on that research. Daniel wrote that he wanted us to talk about passion. That's always something nice to talk about, right? I mean, so yeah, I said, sure, I'll sign up. And also how research can shape public policy, and about how UMass Boston can be more effective in its work in the broader community. I have only a few minutes, so I'm going to first go to the research and show you a little bit of the kind, sort of like through time, the kind of work that I've done, and then talk about power and passion, and leave you with that. There are two areas, okay, let me see now. There are two areas of research that are relevant to the work that what we're talking about today. The first harks back to the first research in education that I did. I'm a sociologist, not an EDD or an education person. I sort of come to the world of education from the point of view of society and sociology. And my focus had always been the Latino community, particularly the history and the development of communities and institutions in this region and beyond. But through my work in the Gaston Institute, I began to focus on policy, and particularly on the differential effect of policies on different groups, particularly different racial ethnic groups. I've done work on welfare reform, on different things. And I had been to Cuba for 4 years in the early 90s. And when I returned, the director of the Gaston Institute at that time, Andres Torres, asked me to do him a favor. And he said, you know what? Take a look at the MCAS. I'm going, okay, let's look at the MCAS. Does everybody know what the MCAS is? Okay. In 1994, the state had begun a process of educational reform that entails significant restructuring of the funding of mechanisms for school districts that favored essentially a more equitable. The issue, the narrative was that that the school systems would become more equitable across the state. It also entailed a very strong accountability component that mirrored those required by No Child Left Behind, the federal legislation. And that's how MCAS was born. MCAS was a vehicle for accountability and reform. The testing had begun in 1998 and had a high stakes component that would start in 2003. And the high stakes was that students would have to pass the 10th grade MCAS in order to graduate. So at Andy's urging, I took a look at the MCAS and looked at what the initial results of the MCAS had been in 1999-98. And I'm showing you the actual tables that we did in old PowerPoint presentations of the 90s. And here's what I found. First of all, we found substantial differences among racial groups in relationship to the outcomes in the MCAS. What I'm showing you here is a percent of students that were failing the MCAS at that time. And here I focus on the 10th grade because it's the high stakes grade. And as you see, Black and Latino 10th graders had more than twice the failure rate of students in both English language arts and science, and twice, and just a bit under in math. You're gonna say, we know this. But the fact is that in 1999, this made the front page of the paper, of the Boston Globe. And the reason for that is that in Massachusetts, public school enrollment was and remains primarily white. The state had given public attention only to the overall pass rates, the aggregated pass rates, and which at that time was between 60 and 70. And everybody was very scared that it was between 60 and 70, but when you look at the disaggregated data, the data disaggregated by race, quite a different picture begins to emerge. That, it was only a matter of time, actually, because No Child Left Behind demanded accountability by racial groups, but Massachusetts was dragging its feet in showing us just what the effect of the MCAS was. In the Latino community, in the African American community, there was tremendous concern about the potential impact of high stakes testing with a standardized test. The Gaston Institute was constantly, at that time, it was constant inquiries about what we were going to do, what could be done. And because people knew that MCAS was one of the hardest tests with the least accommodations in the nation. We could have predicted that the inequality in outcomes would be higher here than in most other states. In fact, Massachusetts to this day shows one of the widest achievement gaps between Latinos and African American students and white students in the nation. So what I'm going to show you here is how that data has, what has happened over time. Here I show you the proficiency rate. At this time, the expectation is not just passing, but becoming proficient. This is the 10th grade data from 2001 to 2012. And as we see, you can see there has been improvement in outcomes through the years. There are a lot of reasons for that. Teachers get better at teaching, students get better at taking the test, the tests got more aligned with the curriculum of the schools, things get better. And, but the gap between the groups remains pretty much steady. You can see the gap on that light blue box in the bottom. It has decreased by about 8 points in that period, but it's still today about 23 points, between all, Latinos and non-Latino students. The Latino community's concern was warranted. When MCAS became high stakes in 2002, about 70% of the Latino students in Lawrence failed the test. That is a lot of kids failing to pass in one small community. But that situation was not isolated in Lawrence. It was something that was generated generally across the state. It was warranted also because we found that when we began to look at the results in those early MCAS testing for English language learners, which make up about 1/3 of the Latino students, but it's a broad group of students of many different language backgrounds. Just to see, we took a look at the MCAS outcomes. I have never shown this slide ever before, so you cannot talk to anybody about this slide. Okay? But this is what the MCAS outcomes for basically for English language learners looked like at that time. At that time, the data did not allow us to disaggregate by language background, but rather by race. So it's disaggregated by race. And but for example, when you see Black, you should see in your head Haitians and Cape Verdeans and people that are learning the language that are also Black. And what we see here is that essentially, what I would call a very dismal set of outcomes, both in math and in English language arts. As I told you, we did not present this data anywhere. We did not publish it. We did not do anything with it. But we began asking questions of the Mass Department of Education, the districts, et cetera, about how they were going to include English language learners in the testing regime. We found that there were plans to include the testing of English language learners who had been in the US for more than 1 year. So the expectation was that in 1 year, students would be able to transition to general education classrooms seamlessly. As we know, that runs against, you're mostly educators, against everything we know about second language acquisition, especially at the academic level. So we also found that there were serious concerns about the way transitional bilingual education, which was the type of bilingual education that was in force at that time, there were serious concerns about the ways in which transitional bilingual education was being implemented. There were funding issues. There were concerns about access to technology and from books in different languages, so that people were feeling that there were real resource differences between English language learners and others. There were also issues of isolation and exclusion within schools. So all the English language learners would be in one area of the school and all the other kids would be in others, and so that was taking place, and it was creating a very difficult environment. And also with a growing diversity of languages among children, there was really an absence of, or a lack of qualified teachers capable of teaching in all those different languages in the transitional bilingual education way. We also found that parent groups and advocates were working with legislators to try to there was a recognition that there was trouble in transitional bilingual education in the state, and that there was efforts on the part of legislation. I don't know if people remember, Jared Barrios really led a lot of efforts around trying to reformulate transitional bilingual education, and we worked on that legislation. But unfortunately, history ran us over. And the way that I say that history ran us over is that Ron Unz from California arrived in the state with a lot of money and basically with a campaign called English for the Children, and tried to basically develop support for a referendum that abolished transitional bilingual education and replace it with immersion programs. He had been successful in passing resolutions like that, both in California and Arizona, and he proceeded to fund it here. This was like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because not only did we know that children don't acquire a second language in a year, we know that the most effective integration of immigrant children is when they're able to manage both cultures equally well, so that they're not constantly having to make choices between home and the world around them. They can seamlessly move from one to the other. This was not considered in this legislation. Nevertheless, Massachusetts voters approved the referendum. The legislature, the speediest approval of legislation happened. Within a month, we had it approved, and by September, the law was being implemented across the state. By 2007, 4 years later, there had been no accounting of the effects of the policy change. In Boston, in the state, anywhere. In Boston, high school students, for example, started showing up in community-based organizations in programs for adult basic ed. Kids that had dropped out of the Boston public schools were showing up in Alianza Hispana, were showing up in DSNI, in places that were doing adult basic education and English as a second language. They had abandoned their own schools and gone to do that. Advocates began to make demands of the Boston public schools to show the data, to begin to do evaluations, to try to understand what had happened. The city council held hearings. Parents began to organize. Policymakers and constituencies, everybody was really trying to understand what the effect was, because we were seeing the effects on the streets. We were seeing the kids on the streets. In 2007, I got a call from Boston Public Schools to ask if we, as the Gaston Institute, would be interested in doing an assessment, and we did. It took almost a year to negotiate the data. I don't know if people have ever done, work with the Boston Public Schools. It moves very slow, and but we did it. And here's what we found. First of all, 41% of BPS enrollment were students whose primary language was one other than English. And of those, about 40% were English language learners. And between 2003, 2006, which was the scope of the first study, we've done two, the third one's gonna start, there was a sharp decline, as you see in the blue line, from 15,000 students in 2003 to 8,400 in 2005. There were problems with intake. For example, parents were being encouraged to opt out of programs. The assessment process was not well carried out. And again, that resulted in the second curve there, which is that English language learners programs were almost disappearing from the Boston public schools. A second finding, which is that finally, we also found that there had been a sharp decline in the outcomes of ELL students. So let me show you. This is the annual high school dropout rate. We could not do cohort dropout rates with the data that we had, so we had to go with annual dropout rates. And overall, we can see that there have been a tremendous increase in the dropout rate for children, for students in high school. 5.5 in 2003 to 12% in 2006. Tripled among ELLs in regular education programs. Remember, I told you that some of them were just put in regular education programs, and doubled among ELLs in SEI programs. Let me show you the MCAS outcomes, because this is really, really interesting. These are pass rates, 10th grade, ELA This is student math, Ella and math. And what you can see is that for ELLs in general education, the decline in the passing rate is from 72% in 1 year to 38% in the second year, and keeps going down. For those in ELL programs, it was slightly less violent, but still the decline was pretty intense. What I want you also to look at is what happens to that blue line, and those are the native speakers of other languages that are English proficient. And as you can see, they're outperforming practically everybody else in the Boston Public Schools. So what we learn is not only that the kids that are learning the language are really at a disadvantage and they're not getting what they need, but that once they do very well. They do very, very well. We released our study in April of 2009. The State Department of Education took the Boston Public Schools to task in their report to the state legislature. By August of that year, as you'll see the headlines, the Department of Justice and the Department of Education had opened up an inquiry into possible violations of civil rights for ELLs in Boston. And by October 2010, they found that Boston had violated the rights of children. What ensued was a total restructuring of programs. All ELLs were reassessed, placed in programs. Language-specific SEI programs were developed, sheltered English immersion programs were developed, and teacher training began in earnest. One of the greatest problems with this is that people assume that teachers would just be able to teach English language learners without any preparation. In fact, the state is now under review, is under oversight of the federal government for precisely that situation across the state, okay? Let me show you what has happened so that you're not totally depressed by this presentation. I want to show you that, things are actually improving. These are the graduation rates for English language learners in Boston for the last few years. And as you see, there's tremendous improvement that has come about because of the attention that the district is getting from the federal legislation, the federal agencies, and the ways that they've had to revamp their programs. Let me talk to you about power now. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there so that we all can be feeling very good. I am sure that you have noticed that these studies used existing data from the state and the districts and used very straightforward, mostly descriptive statistics. There's nothing fancy here, nothing. What made them effective is that they address questions that were not being asked by policymakers and district leaders. They address questions that were being raised by the communities that were being affected by the changes in policy. That researchers are able to respond to constituency-generated questions is what makes this experience both commonplace and highly unique. It is commonplace because doing scientific work to address the questions of constituency is the role of the university. In many, many cases, we respond to the academy as our main constituency. This is, again, reasonable because that's what universities are about. We're building knowledge, and we build knowledge by relating to others that are also in doing the same thing. The problem comes when the academy is only constituency, when the academy is the only constituency, because we wind up speaking to ourselves rather than engaging in dialogue in any kind of broader context. In some cases, we respond to questions and priorities of people in powerful policy positions. But in the cases I have highlighted, it was clear that there was no way we were getting support from the Department of Education or from the district to do this research. They did everything they could so that this data would never see the light of day. Finally, in some cases, we respond to the questions and priorities of those who pay for our research. And we need to be very careful about how that evolves and how that happens and how it narrows our scope and our capacity to act in response to those that do not have the resources to make the research happen. What made this unique in many ways, and in many ways unexpected, is precisely that there were structures within the academy willing, able, and capable of addressing the questions of the voiceless. We have had in this university, and I have benefited from that. I don't know if there would have been any other institution in the world where I could have done the kind of work that I've done here, both in the college that I've been and in the institutes where I've worked. The Trotter, the Gaston, the Institute of Asian American Studies are leaders and have opened the doors for faculty that are interested in this, in the kind of research that I've portrayed here is done in those places. Those institutes were funded specifically to provide voice and access to academic power, to communities largely disenfranchised, and to inform policymakers about those communities so that appropriate policy is developed. Finally, passion. Finding those issues that need voice, those questions that need answering, and using the power of the academy to address them is my passion. That's what I do best. That's where I get up in the morning with energy to really take on the world. Am I an advocate? And Danielle raised that question. Yes. I'm an advocate for equity in education. No question about it. And I'm against the violation of the civil and educational rights of children. No question about me, judge me for that. But I'm also a careful researcher who, as my students, and some of them are here, know I'm just as passionate about the rigor, about turning every stone, about being modest about what we have and what we don't have in the research that we do. My hope is that UMass Boston will always remember that we're a public university with a broad responsibility to provide all constituencies with voice and without, with a commonplace capacity to answer their questions in a scientific manner that, because of its rigor, stands the test of conflict and the scrutiny of public opinion. Thanks very much.
Well, good evening. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to see all of you, so thank you for coming. I'm going to do a little something different. I'm going to speak about my research a little bit more broadly. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have lots of passion, so I hope you'll be able to get that. Higher education, perhaps more than any other American institution, has the ability to impact social justice. As a faculty member in a university, particularly a public urban research university, I share in this responsibility through my research, teaching, and service. Through my research in particular, as I study institutions of higher education and the policies that govern them, I seek to challenge the underlying assumptions of policies and practices that maintain privilege, foster oppression, or reproduce social inequalities in colleges and universities. Take our famed GI Bill, for example. While it has been revered as one of the greatest pieces of legislation to democratize higher education in the United States, African American veterans were systematically excluded from obtaining the same benefits as their white counterparts. From the very beginning of the framing of the bill, when Congressman John Rankin ensured that states in a Jim Crow America would have the authority to provide, and in the case of African Americans, to deny benefits, despite it being a period of state-sanctioned segregation, race was never mentioned in the bill, but it was certainly an issue in practice, as African Americans were often discouraged and more often prohibited from seeking educational benefits. Policies such as these that appear on the surface to be race neutral call into question the notion of equal opportunity. While equal opportunity is an American ideal, it is based on an assumption that the playing field is level and the potential of any American is only bound by their willingness or unwillingness to work hard. Such an assumption fails to recognize the ways socio-historical, economic, and racial contexts impact disparate groups differently, particularly in terms of opportunities for access to and success in college. Thus, those who find themselves at the margins of the academy or society at large are frequently blamed for their social positions. More specifically, educational policies and practices are often used as justification to blame students for inequities rather than examining policies and the implementation of those policies as the source of the problem. Through my research, I seek to interrogate public policy as it relates, through my research, I seek to interrogate public policy as it relates to access and equity in higher education. I am particularly interested in policies and practices that claim race neutrality and purport meritocracy, such as college admissions and developmental education. The goal of my research, therefore, is to inform policy and practices in ways that promote educational access and success in higher education, particularly for historically underrepresented populations. While my research is focused on race and racism in higher education and its stratification, most of my work has focused on remedial education, also known as developmental education, a policy that in some ways encompasses everything that I am most interested in and I am most passionate about. In fact, I believe that developmental education is one of the most important social justice issues confronting higher education today. Whether we speak about college readiness, college admissions, teaching, learning, retention, or college success, developmental education, or preparing students for college while they're in college, is at the heart of all of these matters. Since the mid-1990s, many states, including Massachusetts, have distanced themselves from developmental education by eliminating developmental coursework, ending funding for the courses, and/or limiting enrollment of students considered underprepared, most of whom are disproportionately students of color. College remediation, however, has served as a point of access throughout the history of higher education. Since the 1970s, developmental courses have provided opportunities for students, Blacks, Latinos, and low-income students who might otherwise have been excluded from the academy. This was particularly true at four-year colleges and universities that used developmental education as a way to increase their own enrollments. Today, while states seek to strengthen their economies, develop their workforce, and do their part to improve college completion rates, they also struggle with ways to assess students' college readiness and ways to meet the needs of students who are underprepared, therefore creating what appears to be a crisis, often arguing that too many students are enrolled in developmental courses and it's costing the taxpayer too much. So to understand this issue further, my research has examined the ways these policies reach the policy agenda, the impact of these policies on access and educational outcomes, particularly for people of color, and most recently, as discussed in my new book, which I have over here, I forgot to bring it up, the ways institutions responded to state policies as they sought to comply with them and also maintain their institutional missions. To complete this research, I teamed up with the Education Commission of the States, or ECS, and secured a $1.4 million grant from Lumina Foundation to understand how changes in state policy impacted institutions and to assist policymakers and institutional leaders in leveraging developmental education as a key to college completion. So while many were arguing against the continuation of developmental education and 4-year and some 2-year institutions, my colleagues and I viewed developmental education as an opportunity for college access and success as states and our federal government continue to look for ways to raise the country's educational attainment rates. Our partnership with ECS was critical because ECS had the policy context that my research team and I needed to conduct our research. More specifically, they gave us access to state policymakers before, during, and after our research was conducted. My research team, made up of colleagues and graduate students at UMass Boston, began by writing a comprehensive literature review on developmental education, and then we shared it with state policymakers and other researchers in the field. And together, we were able to develop a framework to begin to understand the ways policy can influence developmental education practice and outcomes across institutions and states. The framework also helped us to understand the role institutions play in shaping developmental education policy. With our conceptual framework to guide us, we decided to further explore this phenomenon by conducting case studies of 5 states. We went to Colorado, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Kentucky, and South Carolina. These states representing a range of policy approaches, from South Carolina that prohibited the state from not only funding developmental education, but it also prohibited 4-year institutions from offering developmental courses, to Kentucky that made increasing the success of students in developmental education a state effort by engaging all educational sectors in the policy development, implementation, and evaluation. Throughout this research, we engaged state policymakers and 4-year institutional leaders through interviews and asked them how and why they collected and monitored data. Did they, for instance, disaggregate outcomes by race and ethnicity? Most didn't, not surprising. How or if they collaborated with community colleges and high schools? Again, most didn't. And ways they sought to improve developmental education instruction and or other means of academic and social support. And thankfully, most of them were working on that. Perhaps most importantly, we asked leaders, see, this is why you don't read off of an iPad. So we asked leaders to talk about how policy, particularly those that ended remediation, impacted their ability to fulfill their institutional missions to serve the students of their region and state. Policymakers had little regard for institutional missions, as they were much more interested in the bottom line. How effective is developmental education? Most believed it wasn't effective at all. And how much does it cost? Most believed, regardless of the effectiveness, it was always too expensive. Institutional leaders told a different story. They talked about the need to serve the students in their region and their state. They talked about the need to meet students where they were, that students, even with the highest test scores, often needed some academic support in college courses. And those with lower test scores often had a lot more to deal with in their personal and social lives than to worry about a placement exam. So while institutional leaders were happy to talk about the ways they continue to fulfill their institutional missions, we also found that they were conflicted, as policies often constrain their abilities to serve students. But this conflict also led to institutions to become creative in the ways they serve students. Some bumped up social and academic support outside the classroom, while others incorporated developmental support in credit-bearing college courses inside the classroom. In other words, despite the policy constraints that faced them, many administrators, faculty, and staff demonstrated a commitment to serving the students that came to them. Although many states continue to debate the role of developmental education and the role it should play in higher education, I'm happy to say that some state lawmakers, for example, those in Kentucky, are beginning to recognize that eliminating developmental education courses does not eliminate the need to serve students who are considered, often arbitrarily, underprepared. Since engaging in this work, I've had opportunities to speak in front of governors, state policymakers, and congressional staff members. And while some of them are clearly turned off when I say developmental education, many are searching for a better way to serve the people of their state or the nation. Institutional leaders who are able to defend their institutional missions and who can demonstrate success in serving a diverse group of students give policymakers an alternative to consider. And so I think that's where we come in here at UMass Boston, because we must continue to do it, and we need to do it more often. While some believe that research should only inform rather than advocate, I, like Miren, disagree. If we believe in social justice, we must be advocates for change. We must advocate to maintain a racially, ethnically, and economically diverse student population, and we must increase the diversity of our faculty. We must be advocates for our students. We must advocate for the Boston High School graduates for whom UMass Boston was always their first choice. And we must advocate remaining true to our institutional mission, because it is that mission that brought me here, and I'm assuming many of you here, when we had opportunities to go elsewhere. Even when policy or other external forces push us in other directions, I believe it is the maintenance of our mission that also keeps us here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Douglas, and I'm also so happy to be here tonight and to be sharing in this celebration event, and I'm really inspired by my colleagues who've spoken before me, so thank you both. So tonight I'm going to share some thoughts about my research and its relevance for policy and practice, and I'm going to kind of walk you through the pathway I'm on with my research. For me, policy relevance and practice relevance are really guiding principles for the research I do. So I'll start by explaining why, then I'll share some findings from my research and how I've worked with policymakers and community partners to make use of and affect change. Before coming to academia, I worked in the child care and early care and education field for almost 20 years, believe it or not, right here in Dorchester and in Roxbury. I was a teacher, I was a program administrator, and I was a quality improvement consultant. As many people in this room from the early childhood side of things know. And over those years, childcare and early care and education went from something that really never made the headlines unless it was a sexual abuse case. It wasn't something that policymakers talked about, and as you probably all know, early care and education is now center stage on the policymaking agenda at pretty much every level, local, state, national, and even international. All eyes are on early care and education now, and it's about time. And I see this as an opportunity for us to make some real headway in improving quality in early care and education and making sure that all young children, not just some young children, but that all young children have access to high quality early care and education with skilled, effective, and caring teachers. So I made a really intentional move from the front lines of early care and education after all those years to move into academia. And I didn't do it so that I could talk to more academics, although all of you are wonderful, and I enjoy that conversation. But I did it because of my commitment to making change and really a desire to bridge the gap between the knowledge that I saw on the front lines and the gap between that knowledge and the policy and research landscape. It was like two different worlds. And so I moved into academia to really focus on improving the quality of childcare and bridging that gap. So a word about policy relevant research. For me, what that means is that it's research that offers usable knowledge that can be used by policymakers and by community partners. And for my work, The purpose of that usability is to improve the quality of childcare and early education, and it has the potential for large-scale impact. And that's another reason I made that shift from working in the field to moving into academia, where I felt like I might have that opportunity to affect larger-scale change. I think that happens, that's made possible by these things, by researchers who develop reciprocal partnerships with policymakers and community partners, and I think that you have talked about ways that can happen. I think researchers can contribute theory that can offer new perspective or new ways of thinking about persistent challenges. And at the same time as being theory-driven, there's also an equally important principle, which is that the research is based in concrete problems and has practical application. So I think you can do both. I don't think it's an either or at all, and I think when you bring the two together, there's a synergistic effect. So part of that usability is developing something that's real and concrete that can solve everyday problems. And I think one of the essential pieces of all that is having continual feedback loops, looking at data together, sharing perspectives, and bringing those diverse perspectives from different roles to bear on the problems. So I want to move now to talk about early care and education quality. For those of you in the room who aren't familiar with the field, this field is very different than K-12 education for a lot of reasons. First of all, there is very little public investment in early care and education. Despite the fact it's on the headlines, if you look at the dollars, they are not going to early care and education. It's largely a privately funded system. It's not a system. It's made up of all millions and millions of little providers who can barely make ends meet. It serves children birth to 5. The benefits of early education are what's being touted in the news now, that we're going to eliminate the achievement gap. We are going to have these amazing outcomes for children short-term and long-term. And those are true when quality is present. But the essential piece of that is it has to be high-quality early care and education. If you don't have quality, you don't get those benefits. So that's why my focus is on the quality side of things. It's a field that's professionalizing really rapidly. It's becoming more educationalized, meaning we're focused a lot on the education mission of the field, not as much on the care mission, which was historically a big piece of the field. And then the workforce, which I think is astounding to many. This workforce, the early care and education workforce, is the largest single sector of the education workforce. It's 1/3 of the whole birth to post-secondary workforce. That's because you need a lot of adults when you have very young children. It's the most racially, linguistically, and diverse workforce, and it is the lowest paid and has the highest turnover. Lots of implications of those characteristics. Okay, so now I'm going to move to talk about quality, and specifically the quality of family engagement and parent-teacher partnerships, because that's been the focus of my work. So there are many dimensions of quality in childcare. The little pie chart here shows some of them. Family engagement and parent-teacher partnerships are one well-recognized dimension of childcare quality. Most states have standards and requirements about family engagement practices in early care and education settings, and research is very clear that this is an essential component of quality that is important for achieving the kinds of outcomes we want for young children and their families. A brief definition of parent-teacher partnerships: these are relationships that are reciprocal, supportive, and respectful, and they have shared power and shared expertise. That's what a partnership is. That's what it looks like. It's also important to know that there's a really strong ethic in the early care and education field that young children are not separate from their families, that this is an interdependent system, and that the early care and education field serves both children and families. Parent-teacher partnerships are also the foundation for a really important role of early care and education, which is to support and strengthen families, to play a role in preventing abuse and neglect, and to deliver trauma-informed care. And if you are at all familiar with the trauma exposure of very young children, the toxic stress exposure of young children, you'll know that this is really important. And childcare and early education have played an important role in this for a long time. So the problem is that there's a gap between this standard and ideal about what high-quality family engagement and parent-teacher partnerships look like and what actually happens in the field. And there's a wide range. There's some amazing sectors in early care and education in terms of their quality of parent-teacher partnerships. But then you have a lot of problems with quality in this area. So the solution from the field has been to train teachers. If we train teachers better, then we're going to have better about how to do family engagement work, then we'll have better outcomes. So my research examines and questions the solution, and it tests possible new ways of thinking about how to improve the quality of parent-teacher partnerships. So I'm going to share just a few key findings from kind of a series of studies that I've been doing over the last 7 or 8 years. So the first study is a study with strengthening families through early care and education in Illinois. And this was, you can see the partners who were involved in this study. So there are community partners and governmental partners and also a federal funding partner. And Strengthening Families Through Early Care and Education was an initiative to improve the capacity of child care centers to support and strengthen families and reduce abuse and neglect. And high-quality parent-teacher partnerships were the foundation for that model. The current study, Trauma-Informed Early Care and Education, you can see the partners here. We have a couple of federal funders, and this is delivered by the Boston Public Health Commission. And this, again, is an effort to support and strengthen families to deliver trauma-informed care, and the centerpiece of this is strong, high-quality parent-teacher partnerships. So that's kind of the thread throughout both of these studies. These were in-depth qualitative case studies, comparative case studies, that really tried to understand the barriers, the underlying barriers to effective parent-teacher partnership and quality improvement in parent-teacher partnerships. And it looked at also, when there were successes, the successful cases, what was it that made them successful? In these studies, they're rooted, both of them, in relational theories and hypotheses about how organizational contexts support and hinder these kinds of relationships. So what I found is that even when teachers get training, when they go back to their workplace, the organizational cultures and structures can either support their ability to transfer what they've learned into their practice, or it can prevent their ability to do so. Training isn't enough, and even individual coaching, which is often touted these days as more effective than training, is often not enough either, and here's why. In conventional or bureaucratic organizational contexts, doing things that look like caring, being responsive, sharing power, those things are seen as unprofessional. Maintaining distance, holding all the expertise, and expecting parents to comply with schools' rules, those all feel like professional ways to be. Another barrier is an organizational culture of disrespect for staff, which I think is best captured by this quote from a teacher in an urban Chicago child care center. She said, "If the child care center wants teachers to support families, the center needs a strengthening staff program. If you're falling apart, you can't be helping other people." So I think you can see how no matter how much training she's going to get, it's not going to deal with her situation. I also found that the structures, things like policies, got in the way, and here's just one example. In my interviews, I've heard teachers describing how they felt like they had to break the rules in order to meet a family where they were and to deliver responsive care, for example, if a family's in crisis. So here teachers are feeling like they're having to break a rule in order to do what they know is best for a particular family. On the flip side, I've spent a lot of time, what's even more fascinating is how is it that people deliver this well? What are the organizational contexts and conditions that enable people to really make improvement and deliver high-quality parent-teacher relationships? And here's what I found here. There are specific organizational structures that can enable partnerships with families, and these structures promote a relational organizational culture that values and rewards reciprocal relationships. It's not just about building a certain kind of relationship, but it's about building the organizational infrastructure to support, promote, measure, and reward responsive relationships. Coming back to policy and practice and what the implications of this kind of research are in terms of professional development efforts to improve parent-teacher partnerships, training is not enough. The context matters, and we need to know how to promote an organizational context like this and the leadership that's needed to enable improvement. Because there's almost no research or practice models for organizational change like this in the early care and education context, that's what my focus is now, developing an intervention to promote relational organizational development that can be paired with other quality improvement initiatives and hopefully achieve greater outcomes. Based on the research that I've done so far, this is a template for comparing key organizational characteristics, the people, structures, and processes that are in the relational organizational form I talked about that supported and promoted parent-teacher partnerships. And it contrasts that with the more conventional organizational characteristics that were barriers. This template is something that I've used as a framework in the research that I've done, but it's also something I've used with community and government partners. And it has been very well received. And people have used it to think about how they can design and think and rethink in new ways about implementing more effective improvement. So the next question is, how do we help organizations who aren't already on the relational column here to move more towards those characteristics? So I'm not really going to go into the whole theory behind where I went next with this, but my colleague Jody Hoffer-Gattel, who's at Brandeis University, and I developed a theory about exactly how such a relational organization would work. Not just in early care and education, but across all sectors and industries where there's work that would be relevant to this. And we thought about what are the kinds of structures that are needed, how do they support high quality relationships, reciprocal interrelating is what we call it on this slide, and how do those result in the desired outcome. So really on a theoretical level, how does this really work and play out and achieving the outcomes that we want. The relational organizational system that we describe here achieves these outcomes not by chance, not just because people happen to like each other and don't like each other in a particular organization, but because the relationships get built into the infrastructure or the architecture of the organization, and because they're built in, because they have those structural supports, they're scalable, they're replicable, and they're sustainable. So knowing how this works, or having a really pretty good theory about it, is great. But my community and governmental partners want to know, how do we make this happen? How do we turn this into action on the ground in early childhood programs to improve outcomes? So that's the work that I'm moved to now, is really focusing on what does an intervention like this look like? What kind of model can we develop that we can then use and test and roll out at a broader scale to help organizations really make the kind of change that needs to happen? So in the studies of trauma-informed practice in Boston early care and education settings, we're looking at that. This is an intervention that pairs the trauma-informed content improvement with an organizational improvement component. So we're looking at what are the pieces of that are working, that aren't working, and developing a model for change based on that. Just to kind of bring all of this back, because I feel like I went way down deep into the theory and now coming back out again. So why does this all matter? What's the impact we're looking for? And I think this quote from a teacher in Boston who's involved in the trauma-informed improvement work kind of captures one level of the kind of outcome we're looking for. So this is a teacher who reported that many of the parents that she worked with didn't want to become engaged or involved. They didn't really want to talk to her. But through her participation in this intervention, she learned to question that assumption. She learned to plan and test creative and innovative strategies and approaches through a new collaborative team structure in her center, and she was really transformed when her efforts paid off, and she talked about this parent. And she said, when I saw her, this parent, I shed a tear because at the beginning of the year, this was a woman who was giving me F-bombs, who wouldn't come to the school, who wouldn't pick up phone calls, who wouldn't return letters, and at the end of the school year now, she's showing up for everything. She's sending me notes, she's writing in the communication log, and she's giving me phone calls just to check in on her daughter. So in conclusion, in terms of contributions for policy, for improving quality, I think this research offers a new way of thinking about parent-teacher partnerships at the organizational and systems level that really move beyond that individualized training teachers in isolation having nothing to do with the context in which they work. And when I talk about this research and theory with community partners and practitioners, it really resonates with them, and in much the same way that the teacher from Chicago who said that they want us to be strengthening families, but they need to be strengthening staff at the same time. So I think this really resonates for people, and it really filled a gap, and I think helped people to understand why things weren't working, why we weren't making progress, and I think that can provide hope. This research, I think, has implications for policy in terms of professional development and quality improvement policies, which are the policies that I'm particularly interested in. Right now, in early care and education, professional development and quality improvement policies are very much designed to change individuals, not organizations and not systems. And in fact, there's almost no capacity within our field right now for shifting that. Similarly, leadership and teamwork development are largely neglected in the field, both in pre-service and in-service professional development. So I've begun working with a national partner now about how we might move this forward in terms of building some capacity in the field at a large scale. And again, this is, I think, what really motivates me and my passion for the field needs a model. They need to know how to do this. And they need it to be well specified, and they need people who can go in and help them figure out how do you transform an organization and create the kind of organizational culture where you can have not only the high quality parent-teacher partnerships, but you can really have a thriving organization that can give all children what they need, which is a great early care and education with caring, effective, and nurturing teachers. So in closing, I want to say I just feel so fortunate to be here at UMass Boston, because I do think that this is a really exceptional place for this kind of work, and that the contributions that this kind of research can make are, I believe, truly valued here. And I think it not only does that benefit me because I can do the research that I'm passionate about, but it benefits, more importantly, the children and families in our communities and beyond. So I'm very grateful. Thank you.
We want to thank Professors Uriarte, Parker, and Douglas for their presentation, and we are now open for questions and answers. I think we might have some answers also. So, with whom might we begin? Yes.
And the reason I wanted to respond was because I feel a little bit like I was involved in the Manhattan Project. I was chair of the Education Committee when the Education Reform Act passed in the Senate. And I remember very clearly that there was going to be a 10th grade test. And I said to Tom Birmingham, I'm not sure we want a test. I think we want a comprehensive assessment system. It's become neither comprehensive, nor is it an assessment, nor is it a system. We retain the word Massachusetts with integrity. But there were many ways to think about assessment. And I think what we don't know about this process, and what is often buried in the history of policymaking, is sort of the nuts and bolts and how it really occurs. And if you remember what happened at the time, we had a Board of Education that actually created the Education Reform Act. They spent 2 years in hearings. They went all around the state. Marty was chair of that board. We had some UMass faculty from Amherst on the committee. And they created that legislation, by and large. And then there was a decision made by the president of the Senate, by the chairman of Ways and Means, and became president of the Senate, that we would get rid of the entire Board of Education. They were supposed to be on staggered terms. They weren't on staggered terms. They all got replaced all at once. And they were replaced in the following manner. The new chairman of the Board of Education was going to be John Silber. And John Silber's experience in public schools was in Chelsea, who after 3 years complained that you can't elevate these schools when you continually have new immigrants coming into these public schools. You remember that complaint? Yeah, thank you, John. And so he felt that the standards were too difficult, but by that time they had already been implemented. And the rest is a tragic history, and we've been struggling with the MCAS ever since. But the fundamental concept was that there would be a test, there would be a student portfolio, there would be teacher assessments, there would be parent assessments, and there would be school assessments. And combined, we would think about how we would assess children and their progress. That never happened. We ended up with a test. So with Anne, and particularly with the work that Anne is doing with regard to early childhood and the proposal that she's been working with, and she does very well at working with policymakers, as you know, the trick is going to be to engage policymakers in the right way, at the right time, with the right information, and to recognize that information often doesn't drive policy. Data often doesn't drive policy until we create settings and mechanisms by which that data influences the decision makers. And there's a level of sophistication and challenge there that we could talk about for many years. But I wanted to sort of give you a little bit of history about how this travesty occurred, and then that might be the basis for thinking about how we might repair the damage.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Any other question? Oh, you must have many questions. Yes.
I think that, unfortunately, many child care provider settings or child care educational settings have often been looked upon as a babysitting site. And with that idea, I think parents are so stressed in their own lives of getting to work and meeting the deadlines that on this parent side of this, we have to as well address the issues of flexibility for parents who have children, okay? Because we are indirectly abusing these children by parents who have hardly any time to help them get dressed in the morning in order to get to work and so on. But I did want to remark upon your theory and had wondered, had you looked at Cotter's change model? You might want to just take a little look at that because we use that a lot in our DNP program as a way of developing a sense of urgency, promoting a sense of trying to find your way as maybe penguins have to find their way out under the ice when they migrate in the wintertime and come back out and so on. So you might want to take a look at that. It's a very exciting theory, and I could see parts of that model operating in what you're doing, but there's been a lot of research done supporting this model, and it might help you with developing this sense of urgency. I think that we have a lot to say about the media and how important the media is in any policy change, because without the stage setting that the media does for us, really very few people are aware. And you're really in a very timely topic right now, and good for you, and congratulations.
I was going to say that I always feel guilty about using the MCAS in the analysis that I do. I mean, I agonize over it because I feel like in using it, and this is part of the sort of the researcher's dilemma, that in using it, you're sort of, creating a narrative for it, and but on the other hand, I always feel, and and you were a policymaker in that policy was made that resulted in that, and therefore the systems that perpetrate that, that continue the MCAS have to answer for it. Have to answer for what the results have been.
Because the policy wasn't designed by educators.
Incidentally,
Oh, are you kidding? The same.
I'm Dave Magnani. I'm Assistant Vice Chancellor here for Corporate and Foundation Relations.
That he was in the legislature. He had something to do with. Did you write it?
Well, yeah, I did. Yes, I did. Yes, yeah. No, but I think what's important, and we can talk about MCAS all day, but I think that what's important to recognize for this particular group, and one of the things that's exciting about being at UMass, and I've worked with Ann on policy before, is that if we do research, unless it finds its way into policy, then we become very much like the ivory tower citadel that is irrelevant to everyone beyond outside the walls of the institutions. So we need to be sophisticated and committed to engage policymakers in not only what we think they should do, but understanding why they do what they do, so that we don't just see them as a blank wall, but rather as a constituent of ours for those of us who do research.
Thank you. I think just to summarize, we had Professor Uriarte showing us how data, disaggregated data in particular, can point the way to perhaps rethinking about policy and what that can mean to communities when properly used. In fact, data quite often is so important that nobody wants to share it. And that a public university, part of its responsibility, is not only to shape a capacity to recognize, to marshal, to aggregate and disaggregate, to interpret, and to use that data to help shape public policy in multiple forms. But to suggest that there are ways within which the data as you represent it yield certain qualities to which Professor Douglas was referring. And then we have Professor Parker focusing on the ways in which policy can be interrogated and use the developmental emphases in education to show that, in fact, it may be a major path to access and equity. In fact, your comment later on that you had some doubts about it earlier is rather illuminating. And Professor Douglas, a relational organizational systems, a systems approach as he looks at things, can help us to understand how people and structures and processes can shape quality, and how that quality can have implications for children, for families and communities. Indeed, as I sat there, I thought I should say something about what happened in 1989 when the UN adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, a child, as defined here, goes up to 18 years old. And then it moved on to a convention on young people, and suggesting what that means for the world at large, if in fact we would take the time to focus on their well-being and what it could mean for society. You should know that we are one of the few countries that has not yet ratified that convention. And it might be important as we discuss these issues as raised here tonight, we reflect on how we can influence that part of public policy in looking at our children and young people. Thank you. We have a reception here for you. Thank the presentation.